Hey everyone, this is Steve from Right Wing Political Junkie, and today I've got a news article here from Axios, and it's been kind of making the rounds. It's been out for a couple of days now, but there's one really kind of telling statistic that's in here that I just kind of wanted to go over, and one of the reasons why it's been really going around. Now, the author is Steph W. Kite, and the headline reads, "Exclusive poll, Young Americans are embracing socialism." So the first paragraph here reads, Generation Z has a more positive view of the word socialism than previous generations and, along with millennials, are more likely to embrace socialistic policies and principles than past generations, according to a new Harris poll given exclusively to Axios. So first I want to talk about the methodology here because we don't really have any good glimpse into it. But there was a total of 2,035 adults polled. And I kind of read down a little bit more into the article, and they did mention that they assume about 37% of the electorate will be Generation Z and Millennials. So to me, what I'm kind of gleaming from this is probably they tried to get somewhere around that 30% mark for what percentage of the people they polled were Millennials and Generation Z. So I don't know this for sure because I don't have access to the actual methodology. I don't have access to the questions that were asked. We don't have really any good specifics about the statistics. We just kind of have to take the results on the face value and how they summarize it. Another thing that I wanted to point out about this, and I'm just going to use this first question here as an example, is that there is a total and then there's a Millennials and Generation Z. So the total, you have to understand, means everyone including Millennials and Generation Z. And then there's a separate statistics that's just for Millennials and Generation Z. So that doesn't mean that the total is not everyone else. The total is everyone else and Millennials and Gen Z, right? So that means if you're trying to figure out what everyone who's not a Millennial and Gen Z think, you have to actually kind of go even further than the total in the opposite direction of where Millennials and Gen Z are. So just for example, if you wanted to know what everyone who's not a Millennial or Gen Z are for this, it's not going to be 66.7. Everyone else besides Millennials and Gen Z are probably somewhere around like the 62% mark that would say that they would approve or they think that the government should provide universal health care. So that's the first question. Should government provide universal health care? And 66.7% of all the total respondents said yes, whereas the Millennials and Gen Zs, 73% of them said absolutely as well. Okay, so to me, I kind of wonder, again, about the methodology of how this question was asked and what certain people's interpretation of what universal health care is, because there's kind of some wiggle room here. For example, would some people consider Obamacare universal health care? That's a good question. Now, Obamacare does not actually have government provision of health care. Instead, the government is essentially mandating that you buy insurance, and then they provide a structure in order for you to go seek out that insurance, right? That's the Obamacare website. You can go and go try to find a healthcare provider in your area. But the bottom line is you are paying an insurance company to provide, I wouldn't say to provide the healthcare, but to cover your healthcare costs, right? To kind of be that insurance for if you have some sort of care that you need. But the government itself is not actually providing the care, nor is the government actually paying for it in that case. Now, the government does pay for Medicare, right? Or other programs like that involve care for individuals who cannot afford it, or I should say, who are in certain circumstances, not necessarily can't afford it. But the government is involved in some health care. It's just not necessarily universal. So some people might have this impression that saying yes means I am approving Obamacare, right? And that's a very different question than, do you think the government should provide health care? Everyone should be under this government-provided care, right? And this also kind of leaves out that privatized care as well. There's no, some people probably might have said, yes, the government should provide universal health care, but also allow for privatized options, right? There's no really understanding of exactly how that question is being interpreted. And I think that kind of makes this not necessarily an accurate thing. It's almost like a very generalized statement, whether you agree or disagree. And that generalized statement could be open to 100 different interpretations, which means the data is not really going to be accurate, I think, for policy, or really to have any substantial understanding of what different individuals' positions are, or what the general pervasive idea is for this particular problem, right? Okay, so government should provide universal health care. 66.7% of everyone said yes. Millennials and Gen Z said absolutely yes. Now, the next question is, government should provide tuition-free college. And I don't think that this is a surprise to anyone that Generation Z and Millennials, who are either about to go into college, or are in college, or have graduated college, or flunked college, or dropped out of college, it doesn't surprise me at all that there's a good chunk of them that are saying, yes, the government should pay for my tuition. So I think we can all understand how those numbers might be skewed. In fact, it's almost 11% difference, right? It's a 10.9% difference between them and the total. Now, once again, that is not, 67% of millennials said yes, and then 56.2% of everyone else said yes. That's not the case. It's probably closer to like 48 to 50% of everyone else said yes. That's still, I think, a pretty staggering number, though. Even almost half of the respondents who were not millennials and not Generation Z were also saying yes, government tuition should be provided, or government should provide for free tuition. Now, this is kind of interesting. I wonder about the methodology. If you look at the question, government should provide tuition-free college. Should provide, is that an alternative to other colleges, for pay-for colleges? Or is that government should just basically institute that every college is free and the government pays for it, right? There's kind of this wiggle room in how the question is being asked. And again, we don't really know the questions, but just taking it on face value, kind of taking it as a good faith, I think that there's really one interesting thing here that needs to be pointed out. So I was watching this a panel, I guess you could say, of young African Americans who were either in college or kind of in this general Millennials and Generation Z grouping, right? So we had some African Americans that were both on the left side of the aisle and some that were on the right side, so some conservatives and some liberals. And it was a pretty good intermix. I think it was obviously more liberal than conservative, but there was still a pretty fair representation of both sides. Now, I gotta hand it to Vice for doing this, because I don't really give a lot of shout outs to Vice. I don't really consider them a really great organization. They seem to be a little slanted, but I do want to give them credit here where it's due. But anyway, the person who was running the panel would just kind of toss out these ideas, these questions, similar to the questions that we have here in the Axios article, like, should the government provide free health care? Should the government provide free college? What are your thoughts on Trump? What are your thoughts on socialism? Like, you would just kind of throw out these questions to the panel, to the group of kids. I call them kids, but they were really adults. And just kind of, let them banter and kind of have an exchange. And it was a really, really good thing. I really enjoyed watching it. But there was one point that I thought was incredible, and I think really goes to the insightfulness that some of these younger generation actually really do have. And so it was about this question of, should the government provide free tuition, right, or tuition-free colleges? And there were two individuals who were on the conservative side that really made an excellent point. And that was the younger generation is being sold really a bill of goods when it comes to college. They're told that in order for them to be successful, they need to go through college and get a degree, right? In order for them to be successful as African Americans in America, you have to go get a degree. It's either that, and again, this is kind of their words, I'm paraphrasing here, but it's either that or go play ball somewhere, right? Become an NBA star, go be a football star, something like that. Like, those are the those are presented as really the only two options of how to be successful in America. So, they're kind of being driven towards college. You really got to go through college. It's the only way to be successful. And then the second thing that they're also being told is follow your dreams, right? Follow your dreams, follow your passion, go after what you want because you can go get it. And the problem is, right, they go through college, they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to get student loans to go through college, and then they come out, they followed their passion, and they don't have any marketable skills, right? They go and get an arts degree, and there's no jobs, right? There's social sciences, and, there's no jobs, right? It's just kind of this, there's no marketable skills that they come out with. They spend hundreds of thousands of dollars pursuing their dreams, pursuing their passions, go into debt, and then they come out and they have no way to recoup any of that money. So then comes this question, what do they do, right? What is the answer? What is the solution to this particular problem? And the real answer is the Mike Rowe answer, right? College is for some, and even some of those who you're getting arts degree, but the thing is, you've got to have a marketable skill. Once you have a skill, then you can go chase after your passion. Once you have a skill that is making you money, making you a respectable individual in the community, and you're earning, you're contributing to the community, then you can start to follow your passion. You can start to go after those things. But it isn't until you found yourself, you've established yourself in the community, you can't really pursue those things because you'll never have money flowing if you just go after it. Or if you do, boy, you got really, really, really lucky, right? You lucked into that circumstance. So that's the answer, right? Is go and learn a skill that's marketable. Figure out what's out there in the job market. What can I get paid well doing? And be okay with doing that for a job. And then just go do that. Go learn that skill and go do it. And then in your spare time, in your extra time, try to build up something for your dreams. Follow your dreams in your downtime, and maybe you can eventually convert that dream into a financial situation, right? And then you can drop whatever that skill was that you learned. That's kind of the solution, right? But it's a cultural solution. It's not something that anybody's going to impose upon them. I mean, the free market right now imposes that. But it's really a cultural answer. The culture has to stop saying, you have to go to college in order to be successful. The community, right? We as a culture have to stop saying, you need to accrue all of this debt. Oh, and you can do that while also following your passion, right? We have to get rid of those two ideas, following your passion and you have to go to college. And until we do that, we're going to continue to funnel kids through this program that don't know any better, don't understand that that's what's happening. And until we do that, it's not going to actually be solved. So what's happening instead is the alternative solution is, well, just have the government pay for it, right? If the government pays for it, the government already pays for public education, right? K through 12 is already public education. Why don't we just extend that through college? Let's just extend it 4 to 6 years. No big deal. Why can't we? We just, have the government's already paying for these things. Let's go ahead and extend it. Well, there's several problems with that. And I think this is this highlights one of the major dangers, I think, of socialism in general, is that it always has mission creep, right? It always has mission creep. Like, we've got this solution over here, it's working for this, so let's go ahead and apply it to a bigger problem. And it just grows and grows and grows and grows. And I would argue that most of the solutions that the government comes up with actually cause more problems than they actually solve, but that's a whole other video, right? Anyway, so we can't necessarily just go into this tuition-free college thing. And the other thing I kind of want to point out about this, and then I'm going to move on to the next question that's in this poll, is if you consider the average American and the average lifespan. So if they are basically raised by their parents until they're 18, then they go into college, and college becomes tuition-free. That means they're, 24 to 25 years old when they get out of college and everything up to that point has essentially been paid for 25 years. And then on the other end of their lifespan, right, so when they're about 65, they get to retire. And they go on Social Security or whatever the funds are that they might have stashed away for themselves. But that means that from 25 to 65, 40 years is how long they have in order to pay off for the first 25 years and the last however long, last 15 years essentially, because the average lifespan is about 80, right? So there's 40 years of earning and 40 years of not earning, right? And we just keep expanding that not earning period. We just keep growing it and growing it. Very, very early on, and I'm not advocating that we do this, but, kids at a very, very young age would work. You'd have 12-year-olds working. You'd have, really, really young youngsters working and working hard, right? And then they would retire at 65, but the average lifespan back then was only about 65. If you made it to 65, good for you. But essentially, there's only about 10 years or 15 years in there of not working. And then, you've got, inside of that, you've got, 50 years of actual work. So there's kind of a balance there that was struck early on. There weren't that many years that you didn't provide some sort of good or service to the community. Now we're shifting it to where it's almost half and half. Half your lifespan is basically, I'm not going to say free. It's not truly free, but to you it doesn't cost anything. And then you have 40 years of actually trying to pay for things. So that's kind of, I think that's really wrecking our economy. You think about it more and more, it's really kind of one of the reasons why I think that we're causing some wage issues in America. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next question. Prefer living in a socialist country. Oof. So this is the one that's been really kind of making the rounds and making the headlines. 49.6% of Millennials and Generation Z said they would prefer living in a socialist country. That's pretty remarkable. Half of them said they would prefer living in a socialist country. So I have two thoughts on how I think that the younger generations come to this. And before I get into those two things, I once again just want to reiterate, 37.2% is the total of everyone, including Millennials and Generation Z. If you start moving, you start trying to figure out who was not in that group, who was not Millennials and Generation Z, that number is probably closer to, it looks to be almost 30% to 28%, somewhere in there. So I think the majority of most people who are not Millennials and Generation Z are definitely against this idea of socialism or living in a socialist country. So let's go into the two factors why I think that the idea of socialism has become so popular amongst today's youth. And it's really the absence of these two things, or the removal of these two things, that has allowed for socialism to become the answer. The first thing is the idea and the really, the really strongly pushed narrative that capitalism is bad. Capitalism is tyrannical. Capitalism is only for the 1%. It's for the haves, not the have-nots. And as long as there's this narrative that capitalism is really, really bad for everybody, then what do you fill that vacuum with, right? If you get rid of capitalism, if you were to say capitalism is a terrible idea, what is the replacement strategy? And the obvious answer to that is socialism, right? Because capitalism at its root is really about the distribution of goods, right? The distribution of goods and services to everybody who is dependent upon those goods and services. And then on top of the needs, there's also the wants, right? So how do you, if you were to take that distribution process, which is capitalism, out of the community, what do you replace it with? How else are you going to distribute the goods and services? And that's really communism, right, that we're talking about, a way of kind of equal distribution, each according to their needs, right? But socialism is really the core of that. Socialism is about social equality. And how do we distribute the goods and services to everyone if we're doing it based upon an equality, based upon the equality standard? So to me, this is where we start to see the idea of intersectionality coming into play. A lot of people haven't really made this connection between socialism and intersectionality, but in my opinion, I think that really what intersectionality has become is an algorithm to figure out equality, right? So if you're going to have socialism, you need socialism because you're getting rid of capitalism, so you need some sort of form of socialism. What is the algorithm? What is the way that you determine who gets what? Well, if you can figure out what level someone is oppressed or what level somebody has been is unequal, right? Then you can figure out, based upon that equation, what they should be provided with. How much above the needs do they get, right? What kind of wants do they have that they're going to be tailored to? So it becomes an inversion, right? The idea is that we invert the problem. We take and everybody who is low on the totem pole now gets flipped up to the top, and now everybody who has been oppressed will suddenly be the most showered with want and gifts, right? And that's kind of the way that it goes. That's kind of the way that they're trying to go. And there isn't really this direct communication between these two concepts, but it's definitely, you can see where those two things are going, right? Socialism is really this concept of equality, right? We need to compensate for, we need to make sure everybody has exactly what they need and want. And how do you figure that? How do you calculate what somebody needs and wants, or who deserves to get what they want? Well, you have to figure out who is the most unequal, right? Whoever is the least equal amongst us, give them what they want until they become equal. And that's really kind of the only way that it could really be done. So that's where you get intersectionality kind of coming to grips with that socialist. That's kind of postmodernism and socialism wrapped up together. Now, that was one thing, right? Removal of capitalism, right? Because capitalism is essentially a downgraded concept. It's horrible, it's tyrannical, only the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. We have a increasing wage gap between the earners, right? The income gap, right? So that's number one. What's number two? The second idea that's really being propagated amongst Millennials and Generation Z is this idea that that the United States is not founded on Judeo-Christian values. Okay, Judeo-Christian values as a moral authority is a bad idea. Okay, and this really kind of started in we've all heard the phrase separation between church and state, but it's really become like the revulsion of church within the state. That's really kind of what's happened. It's not that our political leaders can have some sort of morality that they're making judgments by, and they just apply law based upon those moral standards. No, we can't even have the hint of religion in our government. Not somebody who believes in God and espouses to believe in God is to be shunned, because that means that they are not really government material. They're not really somebody who should be involved in government. So if you are going to make the claim that we are not founded on a Judeo-Christian value set, Judeo-Christian values, just look at the Mike Pences of the world and how he gets humiliated every time that he says something even remotely religious or about his belief system. It's like, this guy should not be. I'm fearful of Mike Pence because of his religious stances, right? It's gotten that bad. And so much so that I think a lot of people will don't want to impeach Trump because they know that means Mike Pence becomes president, right? It's that deeply rooted that they hate Mike Pence even more than they hate Trump, simply because of his religious stances. And that's really true. I mean, it's weird because you'll have these conversations with individuals who will say something like that, and it just kind of blows you away. Like, considering where we were 20 years ago, where almost everybody had to have some sort of religious founding just to even make it in government, now it's kind of like the Millennials and the Gen Z types are being taught, like, no, there's a separation between church and state, and anybody who even says that they believe or uses that as a moral compass, and they're trying to involve themselves in government, means that they are disqualified from it. It's kind of a weird situation, but it's more and more. It's not everybody. It's not necessarily even that Millennials and Generation Z are being told don't become Christians. It's that you cannot espouse your Christian views if you're going to get into government. That's kind of where that goes. So, if you get morality from Judeo-Christian values, if you get rid of that out of the government, right? If you say, we cannot use religious standards or Judeo-Christian standards for morality within our government, what do you replace that with? What then becomes the moral standard? And there's kind of this moral relativism, but there still needs to be some sort of baseline of morality. What is a moral standard by which we should be measuring our government programs? And that suddenly becomes equality, right? The equality of outcome. How do we get everybody to have the equality that they deserve? And that, once again, goes back to intersectionality and socialism. That suddenly becomes the answer. So it's kind of this dual vacuum that is being created by eliminating capitalism and eliminating Judeo-Christian values. And that creates this vacuum which socialism easily fills up as an idea, as a conceptual idea. Now, obviously, I think there's plenty wrong with socialism, but I'm just saying this is really kind of how I think we got to where we are, where the younger generation is starting to view socialism in a much better light simply because they view those other two concepts so negatively. And there has to be something to fill that void. Okay, so moving on to the next one, support abolishing ICE. So support abolishing immigration services, right? Immigration enforcement. And 43.1%. So this is that whole, I'm not entirely sure how this becomes fascist, but that's what they think it is. It's kind of like ICE has become the symbol of fascism in the younger group. And I guess there's like an equation of ICE to brown shirts, right? Like the Nazi brown shirts. Not to say that there actually is. I don't think that there is. But I think for a lot of the younger generation who don't really believe that we should be enforcing our immigration policies, it seems like there's some really harsh tactics being employed against those illegal immigrants, and it's kind of this enforcement of policy that's the Trump policy that they just really dislike, and therefore ICE becomes the symbol of fascism. It's kind of the arm of the Trump administration that is enforcing laws that are fascist laws. And that's why I think, again, you see this huge disparity, almost a 14%, well, it's 13.4% disparity between everyone and where the millennials are. So again, if you think about that, about 1/3 of that 29.7% is Millennials and Generation Z. So that means the real figure of everyone else is probably somewhere around the 20% mark. So it's about 20% probably would support abolishing ICE. And I think that that's sad. Like, I mean, we're talking about the abolition of enforcement. We're talking about the abolition of enforcing laws. Does ICE do everything perfect every time? Absolutely not. I think that immigration to me is a very difficult subject to master, and maybe I'll make a video on it sometime. But I do think that ICE serves a very important role. We need to have some border enforcement. Probably the general overall view of my stance on this is, if you have a country that does not enforce its borders, it does not draw some lines about delineating where its border starts and ends, and you just start allowing everybody to come in and with no repercussions, then you don't really have a country. You don't actually have a country because you haven't defined it. In order for something to actually exist, you have to have some sort of definition for it, right? You have to be able to quantify it in some way. And if you just essentially erase the border and allow anybody to come through without any sort of repercussions to that, then you really have no border, right? It doesn't exist. And if you have no border, you don't have a country. That's just kind of my general, and I know that's a very simplistic view. I typically I deal a lot with generalities. but I think that that's a fairly accurate assessment. Okay, high earnings result of free enterprise. Ooh, this has been a fairly long-standing kind of talking point of the left, is that the rich get richer, the poor get poorer. This is just kind of an extension of that, in the way that they phrase this high earnings result of free enterprise. So, if I'm going to make money, I can use the free enterprise system in order to make money. And here's the thing that really bugs me about all this. Capitalism, at its core, is about free will, right? That's what capitalism is. It's a voluntary exchange of my time that I have worked, my goods and services that I have provided. I received funds for doing that exchange, and now I'm using that money in order to buy goods or services from someone else. And that the level of monetary exchange, the level at which I get for my skills, is really dependent upon my ability to traverse that free enterprise. Now, not to say that certain people don't have a leg up from other people. There certainly are. Some people start out very, very low, start out with nothing, and some people start out with everything. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the people who start out with everything are going to continue to grow and get more. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the poor that don't start out with much at all are going to continue to do that, right? That's one of the great things about the capitalistic system, is that all it takes is a real fine-tuned understanding of how to work the free enterprise system. If you know how to traverse it, if you know how to work the system, you too can get paid, and you don't need to be rich in order to do it. It's just that the rich people already have some sort of founding about how they got there. They're already successful because they understood the system. So because they already have this knowledge, they know how to continue to grow it. There's another point I want to make about this. The rich do not have all the money. In fact, where is their money? Start to think about, where are they putting that money? Where is Bill Gates' money? Like, where is it tangibly? If I could put it in my hands, where is it? It's not under his mattress, right? He's not just like accumulating it in some sort of safe somewhere or under his mattress. He's not, giving it all to Melinda, and Melinda's sitting on it on a throne room or something. It's out there. His cash is flowing. Okay, what he's done is he's taken his money and he has reinvested it. He has his money in investments, and those investments create jobs, right? His investments create work. His investments create goods and services that we all then consume. It's not like he's just sitting on a pile of cash and it's nowhere to be found for everybody else. It's out there. We are all a part. We all have some percentage, essentially, of Bill Gates' money in our pockets or in our checkbooks, right? If we even have any money in our checking accounts. But the bottom line is, like, we are maneuvering his money within the economy, and he's making strategic investments in order to accumulate more and to grow his funds. And he's not just going to, like, one day go to the bank and pull out, however much money, $10 billion, I don't know how much he had, but he's not just going to go down to the bank and just pull it out, right? He's not going to do that. He's got investments everywhere, and that's helping to keep the economy going, helping to keep people employed, helping to produce goods and services. And if you take that out, if you start to say, Bill Gates needs to hand over this percentage of money, what you've essentially done is taken it away from what's creating jobs. You take it away from what's creating all of those goods and services. And where do you put it instead? You give it to people who are doing nothing. You give it to people who are not creating goods and services. Okay? Now, what kind of society are we creating? If we create incentive, you get money for doing nothing, that's what you're going to get more of, right? If you start to subsidize something, you're going to get more of what you subsidize. If you have people who are investing and giving that money into systems that are creating growth, then you're going to get more growth. You're going to get more jobs. And everybody prospers from that. But if you take that money out of the economy, if you take that out of Bill Gates' proverbial pocket and stick it into some sort of government program that just disperses it to people who are not working, well, all you're going to do is incentivize people to not work because they're still going to get paid. Why should they go get a job if they're just going to get money anyway? Why do it? Why would we want to distribute that money? So To me, that's the one of the cruxes of the problem with going to a more socialized system and having this distribution of funds, right? Distributing the wealth is because you may be distributing the wealth, but who are you giving it to? Are you giving it to people who are actually producing, or are you giving it to people who are not producing? And I understand there's definitely part of our culture, part of our population that are incapable, and that we need to have compassion for them. We need to provide for them. We need to have set aside some funds for those people who cannot provide for themselves. But by and large, it's not as many people as we're currently funding. There are many, many people who are very, very capable of working, but we don't have jobs for them because we keep taking jobs away. We keep saying that money should not be in the economy. It should be passed around and distributed to people freely that don't do anything. And that's a really, really serious problem. The other thing about getting rid of the capitalistic system and replacing it with socialism is that you are essentially eliminating free will. You are taking that freedom away from the people. Because if you have capitalism on its surface is really just the free will that I impose it's my free will to distribute my funds however I see fit, right? To whoever I think deserves that money. And it's my decision. It's my distribution of the funds to who I think needs to go to. It's my money. I earned it. I did the work in order to accumulate those funds. Who I decide to give it to should be entirely up to me. But socialism is completely the opposite. Okay, so free market is the exchange of funds between two people, right? It's you provide a good or service, I will compensate for that good or service with a monetary amount, and that monetary amount represents a certain amount of work that I have done, okay, a certain amount of skill or goods that I have produced. So that's the heart of capitalism, right? Is we just exchange, we use money as kind of the lubricant of work, of distribution of goods and services. And the amount of money that I earn is based primarily upon my skill level within that particular field. It's not always that way, but as a general rule, the more skilled you are at a particular task, the more money you're going to make doing that task. So we're lubricating the system with money. Money is really just a means, right? It doesn't have to be American dollars. It doesn't have to be the yen. It could be credits. It could be just anything. It could be breadsticks, right? It could be whatever you want it to be, but there's some sort of evaluation, right? Even in like jail, cigarettes become the monetary exchange, right? Instead of actual cash, it's cigarettes or gum or what have you. So setting that aside for just a second, we got this, free will, the interchange of funds between two people. And what is the idea of socialism? What does socialism do instead? Well, socialism is essentially a third party imposing their will upon that exchange, right? It's society at large saying this third person, this third party that is the government, should actually be the determining factor in whether or not that exchange happens and for how much you should get paid for that good or service that you provide, right? So the government comes in, third party, doesn't even understand the relationship, right? Doesn't understand the relationship I have with my boss, doesn't understand the relationship I have with the company I work for, or doesn't understand the exchange, the relationship I have with the shop owner that I'm buying something from, right? They don't know that exchange. They don't understand. They don't understand the value that I have of who I am going to. All they see are facts and figures that have to do with, the cost of goods, the perhaps my, as we've seen in China, like my social standing with the party, right? What kind of standing do I have in their system with the Communist Party? It's very easy. What type of social standing do I have with the government, right? That suddenly becomes a factor in how much funds I get and who I can do these exchanges with. So now this third party is not only determining whether or not how much money I should be able to exchange, or not just how much money I am receiving for the work that I do, but also who can I go to in order to buy my goods and services, and how much they can charge me for their goods and services. as well as like the amount that I can pay for that good or service, right? They're imposing all of these rules and restrictions on things because they're a third party and they're supposed to be benevolent, right? And that's really kind of this idea that it essentially eliminates any free will that you as an individual have to make a choice in your own life, because you rely upon the government to tell you who you can buy from, how much you earn, how much you can pay for that good or service. That's just a terrible, terrible system. We have eliminated completely free will because we have determined that we cannot use voluntary exchange. We're just not trusted. You cannot trust the consumer to choose for themselves. You need the government to choose for you. Okay? So if you're going to say that high earnings result from free enterprise, okay, maybe there's some argument to be said that capitalism is not perfect, and we could certainly find ways of refining that. I personally believe one of the important things that a government should do is ensure a proper environment for competition in the marketplace. Okay, that antitrust, that non-monopoly system. That's why I'm vehemently against Google being as large as they are, and Facebook and blah blah blah. But how we go about breaking them up, I think, is for a completely different discussion. But I do think that if that's a perfectly valid discussion to have, that we need to figure out a way to make sure that there's more competition in the marketplace, and that we don't just let this group of people, these rich people, continue to be the only ones capable of getting rich. But that almost exclusively has to do with the fact that they are in bed with those politicians. It's because the government makes policies that allow for those people to continue to prosper, while the other smaller companies cannot go to the standards that the government basically sets, because they just simply don't have the capital or the lawyers or the ability to do the innovation when those kind of things happen. So anyway, the last one that I'm going to cover, and I know this video has been really, really long, so I really appreciate everybody who's followed along with me here. Government should allow private insurance. So I think this does kind of go back to the first question, right? Government should provide universal health care, but government should allow private insurance. If you look at the number of people total that are saying, yes, the government should allow private insurance, that number kind of shows that there's a willing to have this duality, right? The government should provide a universal health care, and anybody who wants to have private care can also get that as well. So that's kind of an interesting thing, and I'm not too far from that. I don't necessarily think that we should have universal health care, but I do think that it's a good idea to have kind of a much smaller. I think right now the government provided health care is too big, but I do think that there is a place for those who cannot afford to have their own cannot afford to cover their own health care. There should be some provisions for them. Okay, there definitely should be. My personal opinion is that insurance should be insurance. Okay, and what I mean by that is, if you take car insurance, automobile insurance, my automobile insurance does not cover my gas. It does not cover my breakdowns. It does not cover my mechanic. All right, it doesn't cover. Heck, we just had to shovel out some snow to get our car out of here. It doesn't cover that. But yet that's how I think most people view healthcare insurance, is that it needs to cover every single thing that you go for. Every pill that you get, every prescription that you're getting filled, every doctor visit you go to, all of that should be covered. Everything. But from what my understanding of insurance is I'm putting aside some money off to the side in case something catastrophic happens. Okay? In order to cover if something really, really bad happens. That's what car insurance is, right? Is if you get in an accident, if something dramatic happens to the automobile, then it's covered. But that's not how we're viewing healthcare insurance. Healthcare insurance is everything is covered. And that's that's kind of what's driven, I think, the explosion in cost to both the healthcare providers and to the healthcare insurances. And it's been very beneficial to the insurance companies in a lot of ways, because that just allows them to grow. they continue to add more and more things to their plans, but that means that they can balloon the cost in order to get insurance, right? Because if you stop directly paying the hospital or your doctor, you're paying the health insurance instead. It's that third party, right? It becomes the government. The insurance company becomes the government. They become the third party that determines how much the doctor can pay, or can ask for you to pay, and determines who you can even go see and whether or not you can go see them. I remember I had a doctor recommend that I go get a procedure done. I went and got the procedure done. After I did so, the insurance rejected it. Why? Because according to their standards, it was unnecessary. It was an unnecessary procedure. Even though my doctor told me it was necessary, they said no. That's the health insurance market for you. So health insurance, that's a pretty good example, I think, of how the government would handle most of our exchanges of goods and services, right? That's exactly, to me, that's kind of the typical blueprint that you would expect to see. That third party that pretends to know better, they're trying to reduce costs, right? The whole point of insurance is to reduce costs across the board so that they can earn as much money as they possibly can. But they want to pay the least amount of money to the doctors as they possibly can, which means they're trying to pressure the doctors to lower their costs, right? It's exactly the same strategy that a government would try to impart upon anybody who is trying to produce a good or service. It's the same. It's so funny that it's that way. We're complaining about health insurance costs ballooning because of the process, yet so many people would say, well, socialism is a good idea because then the government would be able to dictate to everybody how much they could charge. Insurance companies dictate to the doctors how much they can charge, and what procedures they can do. That's what insurance does. So is that the blueprint you want for the entire economy? Is to have this third party delegate how much people can get paid? It's a terrible, terrible process. And health insurance specifically, is kind of a good little experiment, if you will, of what would happen if the government truly was a socialist government. Okay. So anyway, that's just covering it. You guys are welcome to read the rest of the article. I'm not going to go through it. I've taken enough of your time. But those are basically some of the facts and figures and my perspective on them. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button. Let me know that you enjoyed it. And don't forget to subscribe so that you can get notified whenever I post a new one. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your day.